From marble palaces to dust-choked ruins, the rise and fall of empires follow a rhythm older than history itself. Power begins with vision, grows through conquest, and dies from the weight of its own triumphs. From Rome's endless legions to China's celestial dynasties, from the Ottomans to the British Empire, each believed their dominion eternal, until decay whispered otherwise. Pride breeds complacency, bureaucracy suffocates brilliance, and luxury replaces duty. In every age, the same story repeats beneath different banners. Empires do not fall by force alone. They collapse when belief in their purpose fades. What keeps a civilization alive? Is it law, faith, or simply good decisions made at the right moment? Is it the strength of its armies, or the belief that its people will never turn against themselves? What holds a nation together when the harvest fails, when the treasury empties, when crisis blooms, always sound like impossible questions? Every empire that ever ruled the earth thought it had found the answer. Every one of them was wrong. There is a pattern woven through every rise and every fall, a rhythm that repeats across centuries. By looking back at what our ancestors built and what they destroyed, we find more than a lesson. We find a warning, a blueprint, and above all, the unmistakable signs of when ruin truly begins. We measure progress in towers, in currencies, in the reach of our networks, but the ground beneath those towers is older than memory. How many empires would you guess that fell for almost the same reason? Beneath the foundations of our cities sleep the bones of others who once called themselves eternal. The Romans and the Britons, the pharaohs and the kings of clay. Their ghosts lie beneath the glass and steel, their stories compressed into dust. If they could speak, they would tell us what they all discovered too late, that the fall of an empire never begins at its borders. It begins quietly, in the mind, when confidence hardens into certainty, and certainty becomes faith in one's own exception. Empires do not fall by the sword, but by their own weight, by the currency that carries it. History's greatest powers have always mistaken expansion for strength and wealth for permanence. The United States is no different, a nation that rose from revolution to global command, now bound to the same forces it once believed it could control: debt, division, and the quiet exhaustion that comes from endless abundance. To understand why every empire begins to fracture at its height, we have to go back to the beginning, to the first civilization that believed it could master chaos. The answers are written in mud, not marble. Between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the earth once shimmered with the promise of order. Each spring, the rivers overflowed, drowning fields that had fed 100 villages. To survive, men learned to command water as they would one day command nations. They dug canals, built levees, measured rainfall, and from that labor came hierarchy. Someone had to direct the digging, someone to count the grain, someone to decide who ate first. And so the first rulers rose, not warriors, but accountants in the service of the gods. By 3500 BC, their temples stood like mountains of baked brick, ziggurats that touched the sun and cast shadows across the desert. The people called this land Sumer, and they believed it was eternal. In the courtyards of Uruk, scribes pressed symbols into clay, each mark a grain of authority. The first written word was not a prayer or a poem, it was a receipt. Power began as arithmetic. The city's priests held the keys to the granaries, distributing rations in the names of deities carved into stone. The gods owned the harvest, and those who served them decided how it was spent. In years of plenty, faith and food were one. In years of drought, the same system became a noose. Debts replaced devotion. Slavery began not as conquest, but as the price of survival. Grain was currency, and currency was control. The walls of Ur were both monument and cage. Men who had once roamed the plains now lived behind gates guarded by soldiers who fought not for home, but for hierarchy. Trade turned neighbors into rivals. Rivals demanded armies. Armies demanded tribute. The machine of civilization had begun to run on itself. In the space of a few centuries, the Sumerian city-states had risen from mud to myth, and then drowned in the very rivers that made them. From the north came a man named Sargon. Around 2330 BC, he unified the scattered cities of Sumer under one crown and called himself King of the Four Quarters of the world. His scribes recorded victories in languages his subjects could not read. His soldiers carried banners that no enemy could resist. The world, for the first time, belonged to a single will. Roads stretched across deserts, taxes filled palaces, and trade reached from the Levant to the mountains of Anatolia. The Akkadian Empire was a miracle of coordination, proof that control could become a creed. But even miracles have balance sheets. Each conquest demanded more soldiers, each soldier more grain, each grain another hand to sow and harvest. The more perfect the system became, the less it could endure error. When the rains failed and the rivers shifted, the empire that had seemed divine proved fragile as clay. Rebellions erupted in the provinces. Caravans vanished into the sands. Sargon's descendants called themselves gods, but their prayers could not feed their people. Within a century, the empire was gone, and the world forgot its name. The tablets that survived speak only of lament. The storm devoured the land. The great house fell. There was no light in it. Across the desert, another river told the same story, with different words. The Nile flowed like time itself, steady and benevolent, its floods so regular that men mistook them for eternity. On its banks, Egypt built order into geometry. Fields were measured, taxes recorded, calendars aligned to the stars. The pharaoh stood at the center of it all, a bridge between heaven and earth, the living embodiment of Ma'at, divine balance. Under his gaze, the kingdom endured for centuries without change. Stability became faith. Faith became law. The pyramids of Giza glittered like frozen sunlight, each one a monument not only to power, but to certainty. They were tombs for gods who believed they had conquered death, and for a time it seemed they had. The Nile's floods nourished the people. The temples overflowed with offerings, and Egypt called itself eternal. But the flood that had always come began to falter. The waters receded early. The fields cracked beneath the sun. The granaries emptied while the priests still demanded tribute. Faith turned to fury. The pharaoh's divinity was questioned, then ignored. Provinces broke away, cities fell silent, and the first kingdom dissolved not through invasion, but through disbelief. In the inscriptions that survive, scribes whisper despair. The river is dry. Men thirst for water. Every man's son is his own law. Yet even ruin contains renewal. When Egypt rose again under the Middle Kingdom, its rulers called themselves restorers of order, not founders. They believed that remembering the past could prevent its repetition. They were wrong. Memory preserved the pattern. It did not break it. From the ledgers of Sumer to the tombs of Egypt, the rhythm is already set. Cooperation becomes wealth. Wealth becomes power. Power becomes faith, and faith becomes blindness. Every solution becomes its own problem. Every triumph its own undoing. The rivers shift, the monuments crack, and in their ruins, The next empire gathers its strength, convinced that this time will be different. It never is. The fall of Sumer and Akkad did not erase their memory. It hardened into legend, carved into tablets that outlasted the walls that had once sheltered them. Farmers returned to the same plains and built new temples atop the ruins of the old, as if the past could be resurrected by imitation. The gods had changed names, but their appetites remained. Kings once again claimed to rule in their stead, and scribes once again recorded what no one wished to remember, that power was repeating itself, line for line, as it always would. From the dust of Mesopotamia rose Babylon. Hammurabi's laws promised justice where the old empires had known only decree. On tall black stone he engraved his commandments, proclaiming that his word would protect the weak from the strong. Yet his codes did what every system does when written in stone. They fixed what should have remained fluid. Law became ritual, ritual became control, and control demanded obedience. Babylon prospered until its own abundance turned it brittle. The empire's palaces gleamed with imported gold, while the fields beyond its walls withered from exhaustion. The merchants who carried its wealth across deserts and seas could not see that the very trade which enriched the city was hollowing it from within. When its river changed course and its armies grew complacent, Babylon's towers fell as surely as Sargon's. The clay tablets that once recorded the king's justice became the debris of his ambition. Farther west, across mountains and sea, another people were learning the same lessons in their own tongue. On the Greek mainland, Mycenaean kings built citadels whose stones seemed too vast for human hands. Behind those walls, artisans crafted weapons inlaid with gold and traded with every corner of the known world. Their ships crossed the Aegean laden with copper, wine, and slaves. For a brief moment, they believed themselves heirs to the gods. Then the trade routes faltered, the seas grew hostile, and the world they had ordered unraveled with terrifying speed. Palaces that had stored wealth for centuries burned within a single season. The scribes who kept their records vanished, and with them, writing itself disappeared for generations. Civilization collapsed so completely that memory became myth, and the heroes of the Mycenaean Age returned as legends in the poems of Homer. The Bronze Age ended not with conquest, but with silence. From that silence, the world began again. New peoples rose where the old had fallen, each convinced that ruin was the fault of others, never of the pattern itself. In the centuries that followed, the Assyrians marched out from the north with iron in their hands and fire in their wake. They built an empire of order enforced by fear, their roads straight as blades, their monuments carved with scenes of victory so cruel they seemed to gloat at the very idea of mercy. Tribute flowed to Nineveh from a dozen nations, and the kings believed the terror they inspired would last forever. But fear is not loyalty. When their capital burned in 612 BC, the nations they had crushed cheered its flames. The conquerors were remembered not for what they built, but for how they ruled. In their ashes rose Persia, greater in size than any empire before it, ruled not by fear, but by tolerance, or so it claimed. The Persian kings learned from the mistakes of those they replaced. They built roads for trade instead of war, allowed conquered peoples to worship as they pleased, and bound their realm together with coin and courier. From the Mediterranean to the mountains of India, the royal messengers rode, carrying orders sealed with the king's name. Orders that might take months to arrive, but were obeyed as swiftly as if he stood beside them. The empire's heart was not a city or a throne, but a system, a vast engine of administration that turned with the precision of the stars. Yet even precision is mortal. As the generations passed, the satraps grew powerful, the treasury grew fat, and the royal bloodline thinned. The Persians, who had conquered others by their discipline, began to indulge in the same luxury they once despised. When Alexander came from the west, barely more than a boy leading soldiers half mad with faith in his destiny, the empire that had seemed eternal shattered in a few years of campaigning. Its roads, its laws, even its language lived on, but only as ghosts, serving the ambitions of new masters. Alexander's victories redrew the map, but did not change the pattern. His empire died the moment he did, divided among his generals like spoils after a raid. What he had built through genius collapsed through greed, and the unity he promised dissolved into rival kingdoms that spent more energy remembering his glory than building their own. The age of bronze and stone gave way to iron and parchment, but the rhythm remained the same. Creation, expansion, stagnation, and collapse. Each new ruler called his dominion the center of the world. Each died believing his end was an exception. Every ruin left behind was a seed. The laws of Hammurabi became the basis for justice in lands he had never seen. The Mycenaean myths shaped the conscience of Greece. The Persian road became Rome's inheritance. Civilization never truly perished. It only changed names, carrying forward the same fragile bargain between power and survival. The people who rose from the deserts and coastlines of the ancient world did not imagine they were building an empire. They were building safety. Yet safety, when perfected, becomes its opposite. The higher the walls rose, the more they isolated those within them from the truth that walls eventually fall. By the first millennium, BC, the world had learned to call its order divine. Kings ruled by mandate, priests by calculation, soldiers by habit. The old gods had multiplied, taking on new faces, new tongues, but they asked for the same tribute: obedience, labor, sacrifice. In return, they offered what they never could deliver: permanence. Beneath that promise, every empire planted the same seed of its undoing: the belief that prosperity proved virtue, that success was its own justification. And so the cycle continued, as it would continue forever. Each generation certain it had mastered the chaos, each blind to the fact that it was only repeating it. The story of empire begins in the rivers of Sumer and the sands of Egypt, but it never ends there. It moves westward with the sun, carrying in its wake the same questions that no ruler has ever answered. How long can order defy entropy? And at what moment does greatness become decay? The next chapters of that story would be written in the language of iron and ambition, where conquest would mask fragility and civilization would once again mistake its own heartbeat for eternity. When the fires of the early empires burned out, their embers were carried to new lands by merchants, soldiers, and wanderers who still believed in the promise of order. Out of the ruins of Sumer and Akkad rose cities that called themselves Babylon, Hatti, Mycenae, Thebes, names that would fill the maps of the second millennium before Christ with brilliance and ambition. Each inherited the tools of civilization: law, writing, trade, and each convinced itself that it had learned enough from the last collapse to prevent another. The rivers had taught men to build. Now they would teach them to forget. In the fertile plain of the Euphrates, Babylon emerged as the heir of forgotten gods. Hammurabi ruled there around 1750 BC, a lawgiver whose judgments were carved into black stone so that even the blind might feel their authority. He proclaimed his justice eternal, unbending, delivered by divine command. His words endured longer than his city. Babylon's walls gleamed with imported cedar. Its temples glittered with lapis lazuli from mountains 1,000 miles away. and its markets were alive with the murmur of half the known world. Yet the city that claimed to rule by law was ruled by necessity. The same trade that enriched it bound it to distant mines, distant harvests, and distant loyalties. When the caravans stopped coming, when the tin and copper that fed the furnaces of the Bronze Age grew scarce, its order wavered like heat over the desert. To the north, the Hittites rose in the hills of Anatolia, a people of iron before iron's age had come. Their kings built fortresses on stone cliffs, their archives filled with treaties. Their chariots ruled the roads from the Aegean to Mesopotamia. They were engineers of war as well as language, patient builders of a bureaucracy that rivaled any before it. Their scribes recorded the weight of tribute and the names of conquered kings with the precision of accountants, and their gods were as numerous as their cities. The Hittite capital, Hattusa, stood behind walls that seemed indestructible, but indestructible things are only slower to decay. When their enemies discovered their own iron, the Hittite advantage vanished, and the empire that had claimed the thunder as its emblem fell to silence. Across the sea, the Mycenaeans flourished on the rocky hills of Greece. Their palaces gleamed with gold, their fleets crossed the Aegean bearing copper, wine, and arms. They were merchants and raiders in equal measure, bound together by kings who measured worth in plunder. From Crete, they learned the art of administration, from Egypt, the art of display, and from no one, the art of restraint. They built citadels so vast that later generations called their stones the work of giants. Their heroes would one day be remembered as legends: Agamemnon, Achilles, Odysseus. But in their own time, they were only kings of fragile alliances, forever at war, forever in debt to one another. When their trade faltered, their rivalries became sieges, and the walls that had guarded them became prisons. Egypt, too, wore the crown of renewal. The Middle Kingdom had fallen, but the New Kingdom rose upon its bones, richer and more magnificent than ever before. Pharaohs like Thutmose and Ramses commanded armies that reached beyond the Nile, carved their victories into temple walls that glowed red in the desert light, and filled their tombs with treasures meant to buy eternity. Egypt's power stretched deep into Africa, north into Syria, and east toward Babylon. Its wealth was legend, its monuments unmatched. Yet in that splendor lay the same blindness that had undone every dynasty before. Pharaohs measured eternity in granite, not in harvests. They built temples, while the peasants who fed them starved under taxes that no season could satisfy. The gods grew fat while the people thinned, and when the balance broke, there was no one left to repair it. By 1200 BC, the great powers of the Bronze Age formed a glittering web of trade and diplomacy stretching from the Tigris to the Aegean. Gold from Nubia met tin from the Alps. Cedar from Lebanon sailed to the palaces of Crete, and ships bearing cargo for every throne crowded the harbors of the eastern Mediterranean. The kings of these lands called each other brothers and sent gifts of daughters in marriage and letters in clay. They believed they had built not just empires, but a system, an order so interwoven that no part could fall without the rest rising to support it. They mistook connection for stability. The more they traded, the more fragile they became. Then, almost without warning, the system collapsed. Across a generation, the lights of the Bronze Age went out one by one. Cities burned from Anatolia to the Levant, their palaces looted, their languages silenced. The cause was not one disaster, but many: drought, famine, rebellion, invasion, each feeding the other until no empire could hold. The records of Egypt speak of strangers arriving by sea, peoples from the islands, whose ships carried families as well as swords. The Hittites called them destroyers. Others called them the Sea Peoples, refugees and conquerors alike, driven by hunger, war, and the desperation that follows both. They did not merely raid, they replaced. Kingdoms that had lasted 1,000 years vanished into legend in less than 50. When the storm ended, the world was smaller. Writing disappeared from Greece. The Hittite tongue was never heard again. Egypt survived, but wounded, its borders shrunken, its confidence broken. The merchants of Ugarit left letters that never reached their destinations, messages scratched into clay as their city burned. The enemy is upon us. My ships are lost. My soldiers have fled. They were the last words of an age. The collapse of the Bronze Age was the first time civilization itself seemed to fail as a system. For centuries afterward, men would wander among the ruins, naming them after gods and monsters to hide the truth that they had been made by men no wiser than themselves. The survivors told stories to explain what had happened, of divine punishment, of pride, of destiny, but the pattern needed no myth. It was simple. When the world becomes too connected, a single fracture breaks it all. Out of that fracture, new peoples would rise. The Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, each inheriting the memory of the last collapse, but not the lesson. The age of bronze had ended, but the idea of empire had only begun to sharpen. The tools were changing, stone to iron, barter to coin, fear to administration. The pattern remained the same. The old world had burned, the new would learn to light its torches from the embers. For centuries after the fires died, the earth seemed to forget what it had lost. Cities lay in silence, their walls split open by roots, their names erased by new tongues. The generations that followed scavenged among their ruins, using the stones of fallen palaces to build their own homes, shaping their tools not from bronze, but from a darker metal that waited in the mountains. Iron was harder, cheaper, crueler. It required no trade, no delicate alliance between distant mines and royal forges. It was the metal of independence and of war. From the ashes of the Hittite world rose new powers, whose banners carried the memory of none but the desire of all. In the northern plains of Mesopotamia, small kingdoms coalesced around a people who had endured where others vanished. The Assyrians began as traders and herdsmen, but hardship sharpened them into something else. They built their cities not for beauty, but for defense, their armies not for conquest, but for survival. When survival turned to ambition, they marched with an efficiency that the older empires could never have imagined. Iron-tipped spears, disciplined ranks, and roads straight as arrows carried their power farther each year. From Nineveh and Asher, they descended upon the lands that had once ruled them, and the cycle began again, stronger, swifter, more ruthless than before. The Assyrian kings did not pretend to be divine. They claimed to be chosen. Their gods demanded victory, and they provided it with industrial precision. Cities that resisted were erased, their populations scattered across the empire to prevent rebellion. Entire nations vanished into its bureaucracy, their names preserved only in the archives that recorded their tribute. The same clay tablets that once celebrated law and learning now tallied corpses and captives. Fear was currency, and terror its most efficient form of taxation. The empire that had risen from ruins seemed unbreakable, yet behind its perfection lay the same flaw, the conviction that control could last forever. When Assyria's armies grew too large to pay, and its vassals too numerous to trust, the system that had fed on fear collapsed under its own hunger. In 612 BC, the walls of Nineveh fell to the combined fury of Medes and Babylonians. and the conquerors who had carved their name into every stone were left unburied beneath them. Babylon rose once more, rebuilt by kings who claimed to restore the world the Assyrians had destroyed. The hanging gardens and the tower that reached toward heaven were monuments not of faith, but of defiance, proof that civilization could rebuild itself from nothing. Under Nebuchadnezzar, the city became a beacon of wealth and order, its processional avenues lined with blue-glazed lions and its gates shimmering with bronze. The priests spoke of cosmic balance, the scribes of renewal, the people of eternity. But renewal is never rebirth. It is repetition. Within a century, Babylon fell to Persia, and the river that had witnessed 1,000 years of empire flowed on without memory. Beyond the deserts, new centers of power had begun to form. On the Greek mainland, scattered villages grew into city-states, each an experiment in how men might govern themselves without kings. In Athens, citizens argued beneath painted porticos about justice and virtue. In Sparta, warriors trained in silence for wars that never ended. Their walls were thin, their resources meager, but their ideas were stronger than any fortress. When the Persians came westward with armies that seemed to fill the horizon, these small divided cities stood together, long enough to turn back the greatest empire the world had yet seen. At Marathon, at Salamis, and again at Plataea, the Greek phalanx held firm, and an age ended in the shattering of Persian pride. The victors called it freedom. History would call it another beginning. In victory, Greece found the curse that always follows success. The unity that had saved it dissolved into rivalry as swiftly as it had formed. Athens, rich with tribute and restless with confidence, transformed democracy into empire. Its fleets ruled the Aegean, its silver mines filled the treasuries, and its people came to believe that wisdom and wealth could coexist without consequence. The Parthenon rose above the city like a crown of marble, and philosophers debated virtue, while slaves mined the ore that paid for their freedom. Sparta watched with suspicion, then with envy, and finally with rage. The Peloponnesian War that followed consumed them both, a generation-long struggle that left the entire Greek world exhausted. When it ended, nothing remained of their victory but ruins and regrets. North of Greece, a young kingdom was waiting for its moment. Macedonia had long been dismissed as a frontier of shepherds and mercenaries, until a king named Philip drilled his armies into machines of discipline. His son, Alexander, took that machine and aimed it at the horizon. In 13 years, he conquered the world that had once belonged to Persia, marching from the Balkans to the banks of the Indus. No army moved faster, no dream burned brighter. He named cities after himself, filled them with soldiers and scholars, and imagined a single world bound by culture rather than conquest. Yet the very speed of his triumph ensured its failure. When Alexander died at 32, his empire died with him, carved apart by generals who remembered his ambition but not his vision. From their quarrels came kingdoms that spoke his language but forgot his lessons. By 300 B.C., the pattern was complete once more. The empires of bronze had fallen to fire. Those of iron would fall to gold. Wealth became the new god, commerce the new army. Trade routes stretched across continents, binding east to west in webs of profit and dependency. Kings built libraries instead of fortresses, but the knowledge they collected could not save them from themselves. When power concentrates too completely, even peace becomes a form of decay. The age that followed would polish civilization to brilliance, and then watch that brilliance fracture. For beyond the Mediterranean, in a city of 7 hills still learning how to rule itself, a new power was gathering. Its legions were not yet famous, its name not yet feared, but its destiny was already written in the pattern that had governed every empire before it. The lessons of Sumer, of Babylon, of Mycenae, of Egypt and Hatti, all waited to be repeated beneath a new sun. The world was preparing for Rome. As the dust of the old world finally settled, the survivors began to dream again. From the ruins of burnt palaces and the empty courtyards of fallen gods, a new age emerged, leaner, harder, forged in iron rather than in gold. The chaos that had swept away the empires of bronze left behind a single conviction, that survival demanded order. The next empires would build it not through faith or beauty, but through discipline. In the shadow of forgotten ziggurats, the Assyrians rose. They were not born from plenty, but from scarcity. Mountain people hardened by hunger, raised in a land too poor to be gentle. Their kings ruled from cities that looked less like capitals than fortresses. Walls thick enough for chariots to ride upon, gates lined with carvings of lions, warriors, and winged gods whose stone eyes promised both protection and vengeance. From these citadels came armies drilled to perfection, their ranks of spearmen and archers moving like parts of a machine. The Assyrian Empire spread across the Fertile Crescent with the relentlessness of floodwater. Kingdom after kingdom fell before its iron weapons and organized brutality. Resistance was met with annihilation, loyalty with tribute. No ruler before them had understood that terror could be efficient, that fear itself could be a form of currency. Their kings recorded their triumphs not as chronicles, but as boasts. On palace walls they carved scenes of cities burning, captives flayed alive, kings kneeling before their conquerors. They believed fear would keep the world in balance. For a time, it did. Caravans moved safely along the roads of empire. Trade returned to the devastated lands of Mesopotamia, and scribes once again filled their tablets with inventories, taxes, decrees. The Assyrians restored civilization through intimidation, building peace out of the memory of ruin. But fear, like wealth, demands constant renewal. When victories slowed and enemies learned their tactics, the machine faltered. The provinces they had uprooted remained bound to them by nothing but hatred, and the empire that had conquered a continent collapsed in a storm of revenge. In 612 BC, Nineveh burned, and its conquerors made certain no stone remained standing upon another. The empire of fear was gone, its memory lingering only as a warning carved in ash. Out of its ruins rose Persia, the last and greatest of the eastern kingdoms. Where the Assyrians had ruled by terror, the Persians ruled by tolerance. Cyrus the Great and his descendants understood that lasting power came not from destruction, but from inclusion. They allowed the peoples they conquered to keep their gods, their customs, even their kings, so long as they recognized the greater throne of the Shahanshah, the King of Kings. Roads spanned the empire, stretching thousands of miles from the Aegean to the Hindu Kush, patrolled by royal couriers whose speed astonished the ancient world. Neither snow, nor rain, nor darkness, they boasted, can delay the messenger of the great king. Trade flourished, and for the first time since the fall of Babylon, peace spread across Asia. Order, not fear, held the empire together. The Persians governed through a genius of administration unmatched for centuries. Satraps ruled provinces in the king's name, their power checked by networks of spies and scribes who reported directly to the throne. Taxation was measured, fair by ancient standards. Rebellions were rare, and when they came, swift punishment reminded the realm that mercy was not weakness. Even enemies respected Persia's efficiency. Greek travelers who crossed its borders returned home, speaking of roads so perfect they seemed divine, of cities where dozens of languages mingled without chaos. The empire of Cyrus and Darius believed it had achieved what all before had failed to find: the balance between strength and order, freedom and obedience. But balance never lasts. In its comfort, Persia forgot the discipline that had built it. Luxury multiplied, ambition thinned, and at its borders, a younger power watched and learned. That power lay among the fractured hills and islands of the Aegean, where stone cities clung to the coasts and men spoke endlessly of freedom, even as they fought each other for it. Greece was not a single nation, but a mosaic of rival states: Sparta the soldier, Athens the philosopher, Thebes the opportunist, Corinth the trader. What bound them was not unity, but restlessness, the same defiance that had carried them through the long centuries after the Bronze Age collapse. They had no kings to worship, no temples large enough to rival Egypt, yet they had something rarer: the conviction that the destiny of men was not decided by gods, but by themselves. When Persia marched west to conquer them, the Greek cities seemed hopelessly outmatched. The great king's armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. His fleet darkened the sea from horizon to horizon. His wealth outweighed that of every polis combined. Yet at Marathon, at Thermopylae, at Salamis, and finally at Plataea, the Greeks stood firm against the tide. Their victories were small in scale, but vast in meaning. For the first time, the idea of freedom had defeated the machinery of empire. The age of divine kings was ending. The age of human ambition was beginning. The wars left Greece both triumphant and exhausted. The Persians retreated eastward to nurse their pride, and the Greek cities turned their spears upon each other. Athens, swollen with victory and tribute from her allies, transformed into something it had once despised: an empire disguised as a democracy. Its fleets patrolled the Aegean like legions, extracting payment in the name of unity. Its temples gleamed with marble bought by foreign taxes. Sparta, austere and proud, watched with growing hatred. The war that followed between them devoured a generation and left both bleeding. When it ended, the dream of Greek freedom lay as broken as the statues that lined its ruined streets. Yet even in defeat, Greece had altered the world. It had proved that empires could be challenged, that men could think and fight as individuals, that knowledge itself could be a form of power. From its shattered cities would rise one man who carried that idea farther than any army before him. A prince from a northern kingdom, heir to both the discipline of Persia and the ambition of Greece. His name was Alexander, and his conquests would stretch from the Nile to the Indus, uniting east and west in a single breath before vanishing just as swiftly. But that story belongs to the next fall, the one that would teach the world how short-lived even the greatest dreams of unity can be. When Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BC, the world he had built seemed to stop breathing. The conqueror who had crossed continents and burned his name into the horizon left no heir strong enough to bear it. His empire was not divided so much as devoured. Generals who had marched at his side turned their swords on each other, carving kingdoms from the carcass of conquest. They called themselves successors, but their crowns were bought with betrayal. The unity Alexander had imagined dissolved into a map of shifting borders, each city-state and province serving a different master. The age of heroes had ended. The age of administrators had begun. Ptolemy took Egypt, the most stable jewel of Alexander's realm. From his new capital at Alexandria, he ruled not only with soldiers, but with scholars. The city became a monument to intellect, its lighthouse rising from the sea like a pillar of flame. its library gathering every known text of the ancient world. For a century, philosophers, mathematicians, and astronomers filled its halls, believing they were preserving the wisdom of eternity. Yet knowledge could not protect the empire that housed it. The Ptolemies grew decadent, their courts dripping with luxury that mocked the simplicity of their founder. The Nile, that had sustained dynasties for 3,000 years, now fed only the pride of its rulers. Beneath the marble and learning, decay began its silent work. To the east, the Seleucids inherited Persia and everything that came with it: vastness, diversity, and the impossibility of controlling either. Their capital at Antioch glittered with Greek theatres and Persian gardens, but beyond its walls the empire frayed. The languages, faiths, and loyalties of 100 peoples pulled at its seams. Each generation of kings demanded more tribute, raised more armies, and built more palaces, as if the weight of splendor could prevent collapse. It could not. Their borders contracted, their subjects rebelled, their generals plotted. The Seleucid realm would die a slow death, undone not by invasion, but by the same administrative perfection that once made it strong. Order, when pursued too far, becomes its own undoing. Farther west, in the mountains of Macedon and the coasts of Asia Minor, smaller kingdoms played at empire in miniature. Pergamon, Epirus, Bactria, each a spark of ambition flickering against the dark. They built libraries to rival Alexandria, minted coins bearing the faces of gods who had once been kings, and waged wars no one would remember. The Mediterranean became a theatre of repetition, every ruler performing the same role with fewer lines. Behind the curtains of marble and ceremony, the great experiment of the Hellenistic age was dying. Not with conquest, but with exhaustion. The Greeks had taught the world to think, and in doing so, they had exposed the mind's most fatal illusion, that reason could escape the cycle of power. Their philosophers argued about virtue while their soldiers enslaved new provinces. Their artists sculpted perfection while their politicians sold freedom for comfort. For a century after Alexander's death, the Greek world remained dazzling, but it was a brilliance already fading, the last light of an oil lamp burning itself out. Meanwhile, across the western sea, another city was learning the craft of empire. Rome had begun as a frontier settlement, a republic born from rebellion against kingship. Its people were practical where others had been idealistic, disciplined where others had been visionary. They built roads instead of monuments, alliances instead of philosophies. Each victory fed the next, not through passion, but through method. What the Greeks had dreamed, the Romans would systematize. They studied every power that had come before and borrowed what they needed: Assyrian discipline, Persian administration, Greek culture, Egyptian religion. In the process, they created something the ancient world had never seen: an empire that did not depend on the genius of one man, but on the endurance of a system. By 200 BC, the balance of the Mediterranean had shifted. The successor kingdoms of Alexander bowed beneath the weight of their debts and decadence, while Rome's legions grew sharper with every campaign. When Greek envoys first stood before the Roman Senate, they saw no marble palaces, no golden thrones, only stern men in worn armor, debating how to conquer them without seeming to want to. The Romans would claim they fought for security, not for power. Every empire begins with that lie. Within a generation, Macedon was a province, Greece a client, and the glory that had once measured the heavens found itself reduced to footnotes in Roman chronicles. The world's language remained Greek, but its orders were now spoken in Latin. Thus the cycle turned again. The empires of order had brought stability to chaos, and in doing so, had created new chaos waiting to be mastered. The torch of dominion passed westward, carried by armies that built roads instead of myths, contracts instead of hymns. The old gods watched from their ruined temples as their lessons were repackaged and repeated by new hands. Rome would rise where Greece had fallen, calling itself eternal as all empires do, confident that its strength lay in reason rather than faith, in law rather than luck. It would take centuries for it to learn that the difference is an illusion. It began with discipline, not destiny. Rome was never meant to rule the world. It simply refused to stop expanding. What began as a cluster of farms on the banks of the Tiber hardened into a republic built on duty. Men bound not by faith in a god or a monarch, but by allegiance to an idea. Res publica, the common thing. Their founders distrusted kings, despised luxury, and measured virtue in restraint. A Roman was judged not by what he owned, but by how he served. Out of that severity, empire was born. They built roads that cut across mountains, bridges that outlived the men who designed them, aqueducts that carried water farther than belief itself. Each new construction was a declaration of permanence, each conquest a practical necessity disguised as defense. Rome fought wars to preserve peace and enslaved nations to preserve order. When enemies threatened, the Republic answered with its legions, citizen armies disciplined beyond precedent, soldiers who fought less for glory than for obligation. The Roman camp was the mirror of Rome itself, geometric, efficient, unyielding. Wherever the legions marched, they carried with them the habits of their city: law, architecture, hierarchy. What they conquered, they colonized. What they colonized, they Romanized. For centuries, the Republic seemed immune to the sickness that had undone every other empire. Its citizens held to a code of austerity, its magistrates to the fiction of equality before law. While kings elsewhere claimed divine favor, Rome placed its gods behind its citizens as patrons rather than masters. Yet within the very order that made it strong lay the seed of its transformation. Victory brings spoils, and spoils bring envy. As Rome's wars multiplied, so did its wealth, and wealth proved a more seductive conqueror than any army. By the 2nd century BC, the republic that had conquered the Mediterranean had begun to devour itself. The small farms that once sustained its citizens were replaced by vast estates worked by slaves captured from conquered lands. The virtues of service and simplicity gave way to greed disguised as ambition. Senators, who had once lived modestly, now competed in displays of luxury. Generals who had once served the state now served their own legend. The city that had overthrown kings created new ones in armor. Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, names that would define the twilight of the Republic. Each swore to defend its ideals, and each in turn destroyed them. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC, the Republic's fate was sealed. Rome's armies no longer belonged to the Senate or to the people. They belonged to their commanders. The civil wars that followed bled the state dry, replacing duty with desperation, law with decree. When the fighting ended, the people did not mourn the loss of their freedom. They welcomed its disappearance. Exhausted by chaos, they desired only stability. Augustus gave it to them. The Republic had died, but the illusion of its life endured, reborn as empire. Under Augustus, Rome entered an age that later generations would call golden. The streets were paved with marble, the borders secured by legions stationed from Britain to Syria. The emperor called himself princeps, first among equals, a title so modest it disguised his absolute power. He reformed the treasury, rebuilt the temples, and proclaimed a return to traditional virtue. Poets praised him as the restorer of peace. Sculptors carved his face into the very image of youth. Yet beneath that perfection, the transformation was complete. The citizen had become a subject, the soldier a servant of empire. The Republic's body still moved, but its soul was gone. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, stretched across 2 centuries and 3 continents. It was the longest calm the ancient world had ever known. Merchants could travel from the Atlantic to the Euphrates without fear. Letters reached distant provinces faster than news could be believed. And the empire's roads connected more than cities. They connected destinies. The Mediterranean became a Roman lake, ringed with ports and garrisons that mirrored the capital's order. From Spain to Judea, marble forums rose, aqueducts spanned valleys, theatres echoed with Latin verse. Civilization itself seemed to wear the Roman face. But peace is never free. To maintain it required armies that never rested, taxes that never ceased, and faith in a bureaucracy that grew as vast as the empire it governed. The same roads that carried legions also carried corruption. The same provinces that filled the coffers also emptied them through rebellion. Prosperity turned into dependence. The empire's wealth flowed toward its center like blood toward a heart too weary to beat. The capital glittered while the countryside languished, and the citizens who once built their own republic now watched slaves and foreigners do it for them. Comfort had replaced purpose. The Roman currency told the story in miniature. The silver denarius, once pure and trusted from Britain to Egypt, began to change. Each emperor, needing to pay his legions or fund his monuments, reduced its purity by a fraction, stretching the metal further, buying time at the cost of value. By the time of Nero, the coin's silver had fallen from nearly 100% to less than 90%. Under the later emperors, it sank to dust. Inflation followed as surely as conquest, and the empire that had been built on discipline now ran on illusion. Money still bore the emperor's image, but its worth was only belief. And belief is the most fragile form of wealth. Still, the world looked at Rome and saw eternity. Its monuments defied decay. Its legions kept watch at the edges of the known world. Its language filled the air like law itself. To live under Rome was to live beneath the conviction that nothing greater could come after. That is how every empire feels at its height. Unassailable, eternal, blind to the tremors beneath its own foundations. For the cracks were already spreading, in its borders, in its faith, in the very idea of what it meant to be Roman. The peace that Augustus had forged through strength would one day collapse under the same strength turned inward. The machine that had mastered the world had begun, quietly, to consume itself. The cracks that spread through the empire did not appear suddenly. They crept like ivy along marble, quiet and relentless. After Augustus came emperors who mistook his restraint for weakness and his peace for permission. Caligula demanded worship, Nero demanded applause, and both discovered how quickly adoration curdles into assassination. Rome had mastered every art except succession. Power was personal again, and each new ruler arrived by conspiracy, revolt, or sheer exhaustion. The Senate that had once governed now performed ceremonies for survival. The people who had once chosen their leaders now chose only whom to blame. The empire endured not because it was stable, but because it was vast, too immense to fall all at once. Its borders grew harder to defend. Along the Rhine and the Danube, tribes pressed against the frontier, like waves against a cliff. Some came as raiders, others as refugees, seeking the wealth and safety that Rome seemed to promise, even in decay. Generals stationed on the frontier wielded more power than the emperors in the capital. Their legions owed loyalty not to the state, but to the hand that paid them. When pay was late, rebellion was near. The empire's strength, its army, became its most dangerous weakness. In the 3rd century AD, Rome saw more emperors die in battle or assassination than it had provinces to bury them in. The century of civil war nearly finished what no foreign enemy could. The economy followed the sword into chaos. Inflation devoured savings. Corruption hollowed the provinces, and the silver coin that once bound the empire together became little more than plated bronze. Markets withered as trust vanished. Cities shrank, roads fell into disrepair, and even Rome itself, once the beating heart of the world, filled with ruins that no one bothered to rebuild. Bread remained free, circuses continued, but both were theatre for a populace that had forgotten citizenship. The state provided, and the people obeyed. Liberty had faded so gradually that no one noticed it was gone. Out of desperation came reform. Diocletian, a soldier emperor from the provinces, tried to repair the machine by dividing it in two, east and west, each with its own ruler, each half meant to strengthen the other. It worked for a while. The eastern capital at Byzantium, soon to be called Constantinople, flourished under careful administration, while the western half staggered under the weight of its debts and invasions. Diocletian restructured the army, imposed price controls, and demanded divine honors for the emperor, turning bureaucracy into theology. The empire became efficient again, but also inhuman. A web of officials, taxes, and decrees stretching from the Atlantic to the deserts of Arabia. It could regulate everything except decay. When Constantine came to power a century later, he found the empire united only in weariness. Seeking a new foundation, he turned to the growing faith that had spread through the empire's underclass, Christianity. What had begun as a persecuted sect of laborers and slaves became, under imperial sanction, the moral glue of a tired civilization. The cross replaced the eagle, the altars of Jupiter gave way to basilicas, and the old gods retreated into myth. The empire had changed its soul, but not its condition. It was still an empire, and the contradictions that had undone its ancestors would undo it as well. The 4th century brought brief revival, then slow collapse. The frontiers broke under waves of migrations, Visigoths fleeing from the Huns, Vandals sweeping through Gaul, Franks and Alemanni crossing rivers that no legion guarded. The empire no longer conquered, it negotiated. Barbarians were settled within its borders as foederati. Allies paid to defend what they once attacked. They adopted Roman names, Roman titles, Roman gold, but their allegiance was to their own survival. When Rome could no longer pay them, they took what they were owed in land and blood. In 410 AD, Alaric and his Gothic army marched through the gates of the Eternal City. For 3 days, Rome burned, not as a battlefield, but as a symbol. The city that had conquered the world was now just another prize in its long chain of conquests. Shock spread through the empire like contagion. For the first time in 8 centuries, Rome had fallen to foreign hands. Yet even then the empire staggered on, its bureaucracy still issuing decrees, its armies still fighting battles whose outcomes no longer mattered. In the east, Constantinople stood defiant, rich, fortified, and fortunate. Its rulers believed themselves the inheritors of Rome's destiny, and in a sense they were. Greek became the language of law, Christianity its creed, and the empire survived not through conquest, but through adaptation. The Byzantines learned to bend without breaking, to bribe rather than fight, to endure rather than expand. In them, Rome lived on as an idea, But in the West, the idea itself had run out of time. By the middle of the 5th century, the Western Empire had become a memory performed by its own ghosts. Armies were mercenary, emperors were puppets, and provinces governed themselves while pretending to obey. In 476 AD, when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus, there was no great battle, no fire, no thunder. The empire ended with a shrug. The Senate still met for a while, coins were still minted, but the world had changed. What had begun as a republic of farmers and soldiers had become an empire of clerks and mercenaries. Its faith spent, its glory spent, its people too weary to mourn what they had lost. Rome's fall was not a single event, but a process. The slow collapse of complexity into simplicity, of luxury into necessity, of pride into survival. Its ruin did not come from invasion or rebellion, but from indifference. It had outlived its purpose, yet in dying, it scattered its inheritance across continents, its language, its laws, its roads, its religion. The pattern, as always, did not end. It only moved. The fragments of Rome would gather themselves again in new forms, new faiths, new empires that would borrow its image and repeat its fate. Byzantium, the Caliphate, Christendom, each would call itself eternal. Each would learn that eternity is the briefest illusion of all. When the Western Empire fell, the world did not collapse. It simply turned its face east. Beyond the Balkans and the Bosporus, the city that Constantine had raised as his new capital still stood, its walls gleaming over the Sea of Marmara like the reflection of a vanished age. Constantinople did not inherit Rome's armies or its citizens. It inherited its memory. Within its ramparts, the empire survived in miniature, smaller, leaner, but infinitely more cautious. The Byzantines learned what Rome never could, that survival is a skill, not a right. They ruled through endurance rather than ambition. Their diplomacy was sharper than their swords, their bureaucracy deeper than their coffers. Emperors came and went, assassinated or exiled, yet the state endured, preserved by a machinery of habit perfected over centuries. They no longer spoke Latin, but Greek. They no longer conquered, but negotiated. Their strength lay not in the number of their armies, but in their ability to make others fight in their place. Gold flowed where legions once marched. Spies replaced scouts. Alliances replaced annexations. From this calculated restraint emerged a kind of genius, a civilization that outlasted every enemy by mastering the art of postponement. Faith had become the new empire. Christianity, once the creed of Rome's persecuted, now ruled as Rome's successor. Cathedrals rose where temples had fallen. Bishops replaced generals as governors of men's souls. The cross became the new imperial standard, and the concept of the divine moved from marble to scripture. Byzantium clothed its politics in theology and called it destiny. To its east, Islam was rising with equal conviction, proclaiming a different revelation but a similar ambition: to unite the world under a single truth. In the deserts of Arabia, a new empire began without walls, born not from the ruins of Rome, but from the faith of a prophet. When Muhammad's followers carried his message beyond Mecca, they discovered what Rome and Persia had both forgotten. That belief could be more powerful than administration. Within a century of his death, in 632 AD, the armies of Islam had swept across 3 continents. The caliphate stretched from Spain to India, bound not by infrastructure, but by conviction. Its soldiers fought with a simplicity that confounded the empires of bureaucracy they encountered. They had no need for monuments. The word of God was monument enough. Damascus, Baghdad, and later Cairo became the centers of a new civilization, heirs to Greek philosophy, Persian science, and Indian mathematics. The torch of learning, nearly extinguished in Europe, burned brightly beneath the crescent moon. The Byzantine Empire, hemmed in by this new power, adapted once again. It allied with faith against fear, calling itself the defender of Christendom, even as it bartered with its Muslim neighbors for peace. Wars flared and faded. Frontiers shifted like tides. The old dream of empire became theology, a belief that history itself served a divine plan. Yet beneath the hymns and icons, the same pattern unfolded. Wealth concentrated in the capital, bureaucracy multiplied. Emperors spent fortunes on intrigue and ceremony, while their frontiers decayed. The East had survived Rome's fall, but not its logic. Farther west, among the ruins of the old provinces, new kingdoms began to form, small, unstable, but hungry. Frankish, Gothic, Saxon. Names of tribes that had once been footnotes in Roman annals now crowned themselves with the titles of kings. Their palaces rose on foundations of abandoned villas. Their thrones stood where governors once sat. They spoke of God and destiny, but ruled by the sword. In Gaul, the descendants of Clovis would forge the realm that became France. In the misted islands beyond the Channel, Anglo-Saxon kings would blend Roman law with Germanic custom to shape England. Each called itself the guardian of civilization, yet all built on bones. From these fractured realms grew the idea that would define 1,000 years, Christendom. Where Rome had unified through conquest, Europe would unify through belief. The church became the empire's ghost, the one institution that transcended borders, outlasting kings and outliving dynasties. Popes crowned emperors, and emperors protected popes, though both claimed authority from heaven alone. It was an uneasy partnership of power and piety, destined to clash yet impossible to separate. From its tensions came a civilization, not an empire of walls, but of words and rituals, a structure as invisible as it was enduring. The Middle Ages began not with darkness, but with a kind of order rediscovered. The monasteries of the West became the new libraries of the world, preserving in candlelight the knowledge that had once filled the libraries of Alexandria and Pergamon. Monks copied Aristotle beside Scripture, Euclid beside the Psalms, unaware that they were keeping alive the tools of their own eventual transformation. Trade revived along the rivers. Cities slowly stirred back to life. The rhythm of faith replaced the rhythm of empire. Seasons of fasting and feasting, prayers at dawn and dusk, the measured certainty of salvation. By the 9th century, the dream of unity had returned under new colors. Charlemagne, king of the Franks, crowned himself emperor of the Romans in 800 AD, reviving a title that had slept for more than 3 centuries. His empire stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube, a patchwork of loyalties held together by oaths and charisma. He built schools, standardized law, and imagined himself heir to Augustus, a Christian Caesar presiding over a peaceful realm. Yet his peace lasted only as long as his life. Upon his death, his heirs divided his empire into fragments, and Europe once again learned that kingdoms founded on bloodlines crumble faster than those founded on belief. From the steppes beyond the known world, a new threat was gathering, a whisper of hoofbeats that would soon become thunder. Nomads who had watched empires rise and fall for millennia were preparing to carve their own dominion from the edges of civilization. The Mongols, the last great horsemen of history, would sweep across Asia like a storm of dust and fire, conquering with speed and cruelty unmatched since the days of Sargon. They would burn cities older than memory, yet also connect worlds that had never touched. In their wake, the medieval world would rediscover its scale and its fragility. But before their coming, the millennium between Rome and the Renaissance unfolded as a single, slow heartbeat. Faith rising, kingdoms forming, empires breaking and reforming under different names. Byzantium endured. The caliphate splintered. Christendom learned to build cathedrals that pointed heavenward, as if to challenge decay itself. For the first time since the rivers of Sumer, humanity seemed to balance power with purpose, until, as always, abundance tipped the scale. What began as faith would become hierarchy. What began as order would end in stagnation. The pattern waited, unchanged beneath new faces, preparing to reveal itself again. The Middle Ages reached their height in confidence. By the 12th century, Europe had grown restless again, no longer content to pray and survive, but determined to expand. Cathedrals climbed above crowded towns like frozen hymns in stone, their spires reaching higher each generation, as if humanity could physically approach the heaven it imagined. Pilgrims crossed continents, merchants followed behind them, and the long dormancy of the Western world gave way to movement. Cities once thought dead swelled with traders and guilds. Universities replaced monasteries as the keepers of learning. The old fear of the world faded, replaced by curiosity. Yet every revival carries within it the beginning of another fall. Faith, which had once united, now began to divide. Popes and emperors contended for supremacy in the name of the same God. In Rome, the papacy reached heights of authority no Caesar had ever dreamed. But its grandeur bred cynicism. Indulgence replaced virtue, politics replaced devotion. Beyond the Alps, monarchs built bureaucracies that rivaled the church's own, taxing, legislating, and warring in the language of divine right. Christendom had learned to speak with one voice only in the chorus of crusade. The call to arms that echoed from Clermont in 1095 promised salvation through conquest. Tens of thousands of knights and peasants marched eastward under the sign of the cross, believing they were reclaiming holy ground. They captured Jerusalem in blood, lost it again, captured it once more, and lost it forever. For 2 centuries, the Crusades fed a machine that could no longer stop itself. Faith turned to habit, habit to enterprise. Behind the banners came merchants who saw in piety a new form of profit. Spices, silk, and knowledge flowed from the east into the counting houses of Venice and Genoa. In their ledgers, the old pattern reappeared. Belief feeding greed, greed demanding order, order decaying into corruption. While Europe fought for heaven, Asia burned. In the 13th century, a whirlwind rose from the plains of Mongolia, a storm that would redraw the borders of the known world. The tribes of the steppe, long scattered and fierce, were bound together under a man who called himself Genghis Khan. He built no temples, wrote no laws, promised no paradise. He demanded only obedience, and from it forged the largest land empire in history. His horsemen rode farther and faster than any army before them, moving across deserts and mountains with the silence of ghosts. Cities that resisted were erased. Those that surrendered paid tribute and were left intact, bewildered by mercy that was only calculation. Baghdad, jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate, fell beneath their hooves in 1258, its libraries thrown into the Tigris until the river ran black with ink. The Mongols did not merely conquer, they annihilated the illusion of permanence. Yet even this storm carried renewal in its wake. Across the wreckage of empires, trade routes reopened, linking China to Europe in a network of exchange that had never before existed. Silk, and porcelain moved west, gold and silver east, and with them ideas, technologies, and diseases. The Pax Mongolica, a strange echo of Rome's old peace, allowed merchants to cross continents under a single set of laws, guarded by horsemen who had destroyed those same lands only years before. It was empire reduced to its essence: movement, communication, profit. For a brief century, the world seemed newly connected, its horizons widened by destruction. But conquest is a flame that devours its fuel. The Mongol domains fractured as quickly as they had formed. The sons of Genghis fought each other for inheritance. Administrators replaced warriors. Wealth softened the hands that had once held reins and bows. Within a few generations, the great Khanates were provinces in all but name, absorbed by the cultures they had conquered. The riders who had terrified the earth settled into cities, married local nobles, and prayed to foreign gods. Their empire, too, mistook vastness for stability and vanished into the dust from which it had come. In Europe, the echo of that collapse took subtler forms. Trade expanded faster than the systems meant to control it. Wealth accumulated in ports and counting houses rather than in monasteries. The merchant replaced the monk as the symbol of prosperity. Cities grew louder, prouder, hungrier. The Black Death arrived along the same roads that commerce had opened, reminding a generation intoxicated by success that nature still ruled. A third of Europe died, and faith, shaken to its roots, began to question itself. The very institutions that had preserved order through centuries of ignorance now faced a rebellion of thought. Out of plague and profit, the modern mind was being born. By the end of the 14th century, the medieval balance had broken. Byzantium, once the fortress of the East, stood isolated behind its ancient walls, waiting for the final siege. The caliphate had fragmented into sultanates and emirates that warred like feudal lords. The Mongol storm had blown itself out. The old centers of power were hollow, but on the western edge of the known world, new forces gathered. Kingdoms armed with gunpowder, ambition, and a sense that history itself could be conquered. The pattern was ready for another turn. Out of the ashes of crusade and plague, out of the gold of merchants and the cannon smoke of new armies, the age of global empire was preparing its ascent. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 did not end an era so much as release its pressure. For centuries, the old world had circled the same shores, its kingdoms divided by faith and fear. Now, a single blast of cannon tore a gate in history. Smoke rose over the Bosporus, mingling with the smell of salt and fire, and a new order stepped through. The echo of that thunder carried far beyond the city's walls. In every capital of Europe, men heard it and understood. Stone could no longer protect them. The future would belong to those who mastered the chemistry of destruction. In the markets of Venice, Genoa, and Lisbon, ambition found a new instrument in the sea. Mariners spoke of currents that led beyond the edge of the map, of lands rich in spice and gold, where no cross or crescent yet ruled. Kings who could no longer expand across their borders turned outward to the horizon. Shipyards rang with hammers, sails whitened the coasts, and a generation of sailors risked eternity for profit. The Atlantic became the new frontier of power. The world was growing larger, and greed was learning to navigate. Portugal moved first. Its captains crept down the western edge of Africa, founding fortresses at every cape, their flags snapping above slave markets and spice warehouses alike. They discovered that control of a single sea lane could purchase an empire more efficiently than 1,000 swords. By the time Vasco da Gama's ships rounded the Cape and reached India in 1498, the Portuguese crown possessed more wealth than it could count, and more enemies than it could see. Gunpowder in the hands of merchants had redrawn the map of faith. Spain followed with thunder. Ferdinand and Isabella, triumphant from the long Reconquista, sought a crusade that would outlast victory. When Columbus sailed west in 1492, he carried the flag of a kingdom still smelling of smoke and sanctity. His discovery transformed the world in a single voyage. Within decades, Spanish ships were crossing the ocean in fleets, carrying soldiers, priests, and diseases more lethal than any weapon. The empires of the Americas fell like doors kicked open. Tenochtitlan became Mexico City, Cusco became Lima, and the mines of Potosi fed Europe's furnaces with rivers of silver. Spain called its wealth divine reward. History would call it the beginning of exhaustion. Gold filled the treasuries, but it bought idleness, not industry. The nation that ruled two hemispheres could no longer feed itself. Each new shipload of treasure devalued the cargo that followed, until the empire that had conquered the world through faith collapsed under arithmetic. Across the Pyrenees, France watched, envious and inspired. The French kings sought grandeur where the Spanish had sought salvation. Their empire was not only an enterprise, but a performance. In the reign of Louis XIV, the state and the monarch became the same organism, pulsing to the rhythm of court ceremony. Versailles gleamed with mirrors and fountains, while the peasants outside its gates ate grass to survive. Armies marched in perfect formation to the music of drums. Ministers spoke of destiny and glory. France believed that beauty could disguise debt. Yet every year the mirrors reflected more emptiness. The wars that had made the king the envy of Europe left his descendants bankrupt. When the guillotine rose in the Place de la Révolution, it was not vengeance, but bookkeeping. England entered the contest quietly, almost by accident. It was a small island of damp fields and restless minds, its people divided by religion and bound by sea. But necessity breeds invention. The English learned to build ships that could outlast storms and governments that could outlast kings. Their victory over the Spanish Armada in 1588 was less a battle than a prophecy. The wind itself seemed to favor them. In that tempest, England glimpsed its future. Power not from land, but from movement. The navy became both sword and shield, its decks crowded with sailors who would later call themselves subjects of an empire that had not yet been named. Trade followed the wake of those ships. The East India Company, founded at the dawn of the 17th century, began as a guild of merchants and ended as a sovereign power. It minted coins, waged wars, and signed treaties in the king's name, but for its own profit. Across the globe, outposts multiplied into colonies, colonies into nations. Sugar from the Caribbean, tea from Ceylon, cotton from Bengal, each commodity another link in a chain that bound continents together. The British learned to rule not by conquest alone, but by habit. Their bureaucracy, carried in ledgers and laws, was a subtler weapon than any musket. In time, it would enslave without seeming to. To the east, the Ottomans ruled an empire older than the memory of their enemies. They called themselves the protectors of faith and the heirs of Rome, yet their strength rested less on religion than on endurance. For 4 centuries, they held the bridge between Europe and Asia, their borders fluctuating like the tides. But the same order that preserved them dulled them. Bureaucracy thickened, innovation slowed. The Janissaries who had once been the empire's elite became its parasites, living relics of victories they no longer won. The sultans surrounded themselves with ritual, convinced that ceremony could replace vigor. Behind the beauty of their mosques, the empire decayed as gently as incense. While monarchs measured power in acreage, Another revolution was unfolding in thought. Gutenberg's press had scattered words across the continent like seeds, and no censor could gather them again. Knowledge multiplied faster than kingdoms could contain it. Luther's defiance of Rome fractured the unity of Christendom, and with that fracture came freedom and blood. The wars of religion that followed turned belief into arithmetic, percentages of Protestant and Catholic dead. When the smoke cleared, faith no longer ruled the mind. Inquiry did. The Enlightenment declared that reason was divine and man his own measure. Kings patronized philosophers who questioned monarchy itself. Merchants funded universities that undermined privilege. The same minds that mapped the heavens also mapped the routes of trade. Science became another empire, its colonies invisible but infinite. Gunpowder, print, and profit together remade the world. Armies marched farther than ever, and their victories were written before the blood dried. The planet became a ledger balanced in cannon and ink. The Portuguese held the coasts of Africa and Asia. The Spanish, the Americas, the French and English, whatever remained. Yet none could rest. Each discovery compelled another. Each colony demanded defense. Each victory created debt. The seas that had seemed boundless began to feel small. To sustain their appetites, empires devoured not only land, but time, mortgaging the future for the illusion of permanence. By the dawn of the 18th century, Europe's capitals pulsed like hearts connected by arteries of trade. London's docks roared with voices from a dozen languages. Amsterdam glittered with gold that had never seen the sun of Holland. Paris trembled between elegance and hunger. The world's wealth flowed toward these centers like blood to a brain, and the rest of the planet was left to pump it there. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean, mines in Mexico, factories along the Thames, each fed the same appetite. Slavery, reborn in industrial form, became the foundation of civilization's conscience. The philosophers who wrote of liberty rarely looked out their windows. War was the inevitable consequence of such proximity. The same oceans that connected empires also carried their rivalries. The Anglo-Dutch conflicts turned the North Sea into a forge. The 7 Years' War spread from Europe to India to the Americas, the first truly global conflict. It left no corner untouched and no empire unchanged. Victories were measured not in glory, but in debt. Spain staggered, France trembled, and Britain emerged preeminent but burdened with an empire it could barely afford to keep. Power had grown too heavy for any one nation to bear. Beneath the triumphs, a quieter transformation was underway. Machines began to hum in English valleys, spinning thread from cotton shipped halfway across the world. Coal replaced wood, steam replaced wind. The Industrial Revolution was not yet named, but its rhythm was unmistakable. Faster, louder, hungrier. Empires that had once fought for territory would soon fight for resources, and the entire planet would become their battlefield. The same technology that enriched them would make their destruction swifter than any before. The map of the world, once a patchwork of isolation, now resembled a net. Every empire pulled at the same strands, and a tremor in one corner rippled through all. Gold from Peru propped up the banks of Amsterdam, whose credit financed British ships that carried French goods to African ports where Portuguese traders waited. The globe had become a single organism, its heartbeat measured in interest rates and gunfire. When one artery broke, all would bleed. For a moment, it seemed the age of discovery had fulfilled its promise. Humanity had circled the planet, mastered the seas, harnessed the elements, and built cities that glowed like constellations. Yet the pattern beneath the brilliance had not changed. Expansion still led to overreach. Wealth still bred decay. Certainty still blinded judgment. The empires of gunpowder believed themselves immortal because they ruled the entire earth. They did not see that they had merely enclosed the arena of their fall. Their destiny would no longer be written in regional collapse, but in global consequence. The world had unified, and unity, history had always warned, is only the prelude to fracture. The 18th century opened with triumph and ended in fire. Europe's empires, swollen with the wealth of the world, began to turn their gaze inward. In Paris, philosophers declared that kings were no more divine than men, that reason should govern where lineage had ruled. Their words spread faster than their authors could imagine, printed by the same presses that once carried royal decrees. Enlightenment lit the capitals like dawn, and with dawn came reckoning. The revolution that began in France was not merely political, it was spiritual. When the Bastille fell in 1789, the echo reached across oceans. Thrones trembled, and the age of divine empire gave way to the age of nations. Revolution was a fever that spread through every system that had claimed eternity. Monarchies fell, republics rose, and the rhetoric of liberty marched beside armies that practiced conquest under a new name: liberation. Napoleon Bonaparte turned ideology into artillery. His legions carried the tricolour from Lisbon to Moscow, dismantling the old order as they went. For a decade, Europe lived in a blaze of motion, each victory a spark that burned the hand that held it. When at last the emperor was defeated and the map redrawn, the dream of universal empire was reborn in the form of balance. A concert of nations pretending equality while preparing for another war. Beyond Europe, the consequences were even greater. The Americas, long treated as treasure houses, declared themselves sovereign. Colonies became republics, and the Western Hemisphere turned into a laboratory of political experiment. Yet independence did not dissolve the pattern. It merely changed the accountants. New nations inherited the debts, the divisions, and the appetites of their masters. Slavery endured under new flags, and the wealth of the old world still dictated the fate of the new. The European empires, though shaken, discovered that they could rule from a distance, not through thrones, but through trade. The 19th century became the high noon of empire. Industrial power gave conquest a precision the ancients could never have imagined. Railroads stitched continents together, telegraphs erased distance, and factories demanded raw materials that only empire could provide. London, Paris, and Berlin became the beating hearts of a single world economy. From these cities, commands traveled by wire and steam to Africa, India, and the Pacific, returning in the form of cotton, coal, tea, and blood. The map of the world filled with colour: red for Britain, blue for France, green for Portugal, yellow for Spain. A painter's palette of possession. Even the oceans had owners. Britain stood at the centre of it all, calling its dominion an empire of liberty. It governed with ledgers and laws, convinced that bureaucracy was benevolence. Its navy controlled the seas, its merchants the markets, its missionaries the souls. In India, the railways carried both grain and famine. In Africa, treaties were signed at gunpoint, and in China, opium replaced diplomacy. The empire's motto was order. Its practice was profit. The sun, they said, never set on British power, but wherever it shone, it illuminated contradiction. Industrial smoke darkened the skies of England, even as its poets sang of progress. The machine that powered prosperity also consumed it. France rebuilt its pride in colonies rather than kings. Algeria, Indochina, Madagascar, each conquest presented as redemption after revolution. The tricolour fluttered over deserts and jungles, its ideals of liberty and fraternity rewritten in the language of commerce. Across the Atlantic, the United States began its own expansion, continental and then global, preaching freedom while annexing territory. The age of exploration had ended, but the age of justification had begun. Science itself became imperial. Geologists mapped continents as if dissecting them. Anthropologists catalogued peoples as specimens of progress, and economists drew equations to prove that empire was efficiency made flesh. Technology replaced theology as the empire's creed. Steamships, telegraphs, and repeating rifles gave the illusion that mastery was permanent. Yet beneath the hum of machinery lay the same old fatigue. Wealth bred arrogance, arrogance bred rivalry, and rivalry summoned the wars that would devour them all. By 1914, Europe had become a powder keg disguised as civilization. The nations that had divided the globe found themselves unable to divide peace among themselves. Alliances formed like tectonic plates, grinding silently until they broke. The spark in Sarajevo was small, but empires are flammable. Within months, the world was at war. The first fought everywhere at once, from the trenches of Flanders to the deserts of Arabia. The machine age turned killing into industry. Shells by the million, men by the million, faith by the handful. When the guns finally fell silent, the old empires lay dismembered. The Ottoman realm vanished into borders drawn by strangers. Austria-Hungary dissolved like mist. Russia erupted in revolution. Britain and France survived, but in surviving, aged a century. The peace that followed was a ledger, not a lesson. Reparations, mandates, debts, the vocabulary of empire rewritten in contracts. The victors carved the Middle East into nations that had never existed, promised independence they did not intend to grant, and proclaimed the war to end wars. Within a generation, the world was burning again. Industrial progress had perfected its own weapon. From the sky came fire. From laboratories came death that moved faster than history could describe. When the Second World War ended in 1945, 2,000 years of empire reached its logical conclusion: global ruin. The collapse was more than military. The idea of empire itself had become untenable. Europe, once the engine of expansion, lay in rubble. Its colonies, starved and conscripted, demanded the freedom that had been promised but never delivered. India won independence not through conquest but through endurance. Africa followed by degrees, its borders still carrying the geometry of European arrogance. The old imperial capitals lost their dominions but kept their habits. The conviction that control, in some form, must continue. Into the vacuum stepped new powers that spoke the language of ideology instead of monarchy. The Soviet Union called itself a workers' paradise. The United States called itself a defender of liberty. Both inherited the same impulse: to shape the world in their own image. Industrial might had given way to ideological fatigue. The struggle between capitalism and communism was not a new story, but a sequel. Two empires repeating the old argument of faith and order, each certain that history would end with their triumph. The wars of religion had become wars of reason, fought with bombs instead of creeds, but the rhythm was identical. Expansion met resistance, resistance justified repression, and progress masked decay. By mid-century, the planet was divided between two spheres of influence, and the phrase world empire no longer meant domination by one power, but captivity shared by all. When the smoke cleared, the European age was over. Spain's treasure had been squandered, France's grandeur drowned in its own revolutions. Britain's dominion handed back to its subjects, the Ottomans consigned to textbooks. The empires of the Gunpowder Age had carried civilization around the globe, and in doing so, had globalized collapse itself. They left behind a world more connected, more knowledgeable, and more unstable than ever before. A world ready for a new inheritor. The pattern had come full circle. Overreach, debt, corruption, and disillusion, the four horsemen of decline, rode again beneath modern banners. The centers of power had shifted, but the logic remained. The greater the reach, the greater the risk. The richer the state, the poorer its soul. In 1945, the torch passed quietly across the Atlantic to a nation that called itself exceptional. Its leaders saw in Europe's ashes not a warning, but an invitation. The United States would inherit the mantle of empire and, inevitably, its burden. The age of gunpowder had ended in smoke, and the age of modern illusion was about to begin. War ruins were still smoking when the new empire rose. Europe lay broken, its capitals starved of light and certainty. Asia bled from wounds carved by 2 world wars. Africa and the Middle East stood waiting in the half-shadows of colonial retreat. Across the oceans, untouched cities hummed with electricity, their factories intact, their people unscarred. The United States had entered the war as a republic and emerged from it as the world's creditor, its savior, and its architect. The century opened beneath its flag. It called its empire by other names: alliance, reconstruction, assistance, but the structure was unmistakable. Dollars replaced legions, corporations replaced garrisons, treaties replaced decrees. Europe was rebuilt with American money and bound with American systems. Japan was recast into a mirror image of its conqueror, its industries resurrected as outposts of global commerce. Even the vanquished became clients, and the victors administrators. Rome had once ruled by road and sword. Washington ruled by contract and wire. The world, weary of command, accepted guidance instead. The Cold War gave this empire its mythology. Freedom and communism stood as twin gods demanding faith, each claiming to deliver salvation through order. The struggle was less a war than a ritual, a contest of images and ideologies that stretched from Berlin's ruins to the jungles of Vietnam. The United States called its system democracy, but its methods were ancient: protect allies, punish dissent, build prosperity to mask control. Empires had always needed an enemy. America found one vast enough to make the planet its stage. From this tension came purpose. The arms race became a creed, the bomb its sacrament. Fear united where faith no longer could. At home, abundance replaced discipline. The factories that had forged weapons now forged comfort: cars, refrigerators, televisions, houses that spread across prairies like marble suburbs of Rome. Consumption became patriotism. Citizens were told not only that they were free, but that their freedom could be measured in the things they owned. The Republic of Duty transformed into a marketplace of appetite. For a time it worked. The economy swelled, the middle class grew, and every new product promised the same miracle: permanence through progress. Yet beneath the glow of neon and optimism, the pattern whispered its warning. Wealth does not unite. It separates. The 1960s exposed the first cracks. The generation raised in comfort began to question the order that had built it. The war in Vietnam turned television into a mirror no empire could bear to face. Images of fire and protest filled the same screens that once sold cars and freedom. The young marched against the war. The old mourned the loss of certainty. The government preached stability. The people demanded meaning. And between them stretched a silence filled with disbelief. Empires fall, not when they are defeated, but when their citizens ceased to believe in their virtue. America's disbelief had begun. Yet the machinery of power rarely notices its own fatigue. The 1970s brought more wealth, more expansion, and the illusion of control restored. The dollar became the world's lifeblood, oil, its circulation. Nations that once ruled others now borrowed from Washington. Their currencies rose and fell with the mood of its markets. Military bases ringed the planet like mile markers of an invisible empire. Even space became a frontier to be conquered, not for faith or gold, but for prestige. When the first man set foot on the moon, it seemed that the Republic had transcended history itself. The age of empire, some said, had ended. They were wrong. History rarely ends in triumph. It ends in imitation. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 appeared to confirm America's destiny. Its rival's flag came down. Its ideology dissolved. Its walls crumbled into souvenirs. For a moment, the world belonged to one power again. Markets opened, borders blurred, and technology replaced territory as the measure of dominance. The internet connected continents faster than armies ever had, and the dollar, freed from gold, became the purest expression of faith in human invention. Yet the pattern had simply changed its costume. Expansion no longer required conquest. It required participation. Every nation became a province in an empire of consumption. The 20th century closed with triumph that felt like serenity. The Pax Americana spread across oceans not by decree, but by design. Networks of trade, alliances of necessity, treaties written in the language of stability. The world seemed smaller, safer, unified by commerce and optimism. But every illusion of permanence conceals its own decline. The cost of maintaining the global order grew invisible, buried in deficits and promises. Factories moved east, debts moved west. The empire fed itself on credit, believing debt could function as faith once had. Its wealth was vast, but its balance sheet was mortal. In the new millennium, the Republic's power turned diffuse. It ruled not only through armies, but through algorithms, systems of finance, surveillance, and communication that spanned the globe. Wars became interventions, occupations became operations, and the language of empire learned to sound benevolent. Yet the same rhythm pulsed beneath every policy, the endless need to project, to secure, to consume. The frontiers of influence extended farther than the reach of understanding. Empires die not from weakness, but from overdefinition. The map of American presence, embassies, bases, corporations, covered the earth like veins on a tired hand. Abundance brought amnesia. The culture that had once celebrated thrift now glorified excess. The politics that had once prized unity now thrived on division. As wealth concentrated, faith in institutions thinned. The people who had been promised equality discovered they were subjects of an empire within their own borders, ruled not by governors but by markets, their allegiance measured in transactions. Cynicism replaced patriotism. Irony replaced belief. The republic of citizens became a republic of consumers, each convinced they were free because they could choose among illusions. Still, the empire endured. It endured through crises that would have crushed older powers. Economic collapse, endless wars, political disarray. Because its foundation was no longer territory or faith, but inertia. The world had nowhere else to go. The dollar remained the planet's currency. Its language, the planet's lingua franca. Its culture, the planet's entertainment. The same tools that eroded its confidence also preserved its supremacy. Like Rome, America survived its contradictions by exporting them. But survival is not the same as vitality. The early 21st century revealed the symptoms of a body still strong, but no longer young. Wars in distant deserts consumed treasure and trust. Recessions hollowed the middle that had once defined its stability. Technology promised connection, but delivered isolation. Politics promised renewal, but rewarded resentment. The empire turned inward, suspicious of the world it had built. Every nation it had lifted now competed with it. Every ally now bargained as an equal. Power, once absolute, had become relative. Influence remained vast, but belief, the invisible architecture of empire, had begun to crack. History, in its quiet cruelty, had returned to its pattern. The United States had risen from necessity, prospered through innovation, and now stood at the edge of its own complexity. Like Spain before it, it was rich in wealth it could not sustain. Like Britain, it ruled more by illusion than control. Like Rome, it mistook endurance for immortality. The same rhythm repeated itself with digital precision: dominance, overreach, complacency, decay. Empires do not fall by invasion anymore. They fall through disconnection, when their people cease to recognize themselves in the world they command. And yet, decline is never only destruction. Each collapse has carried something forward: law from Rome, faith from Byzantium, reason from the Enlightenment. The American empire, too, will leave an inheritance: technology that outlives ideology, networks that remain when nations do not. Its downfall, when it comes, will not be an explosion, but a transformation. The slow transfer of confidence from one center to another. The turning of the wheel that has never stopped. The pattern endures because humanity keeps mistaking it for destiny. The empire that began with liberty will end, as all empires do, with control. The republic that once measured virtue in restraint will measure it in survival. When the currency weakens, when the alliances drift, when the voice that once guided the world begins to sound like an echo, the pattern will be complete. The next power will rise already, burdened by the same inheritance. Wealth as weakness, faith as pretense, order as illusion. The names change, the rhythm does not. Every civilization begins as an argument with chaos and ends as a conversation with itself. America's age has been long and bright, but no light burns without consuming the fuel that feeds it. Somewhere beyond its borders, another city is already building its roads, its currencies, its stories of exception. History waits with perfect patience, sharpening the tools of memory. The wheel will turn again, not with thunder, but with the soft, familiar sound of an empire mistaking itself for the world. Decline never begins with a fall. It begins with comfort. The lights stay bright, the markets hum, the armies still salute, and the citizens still believe that normal is eternal. The walls of the empire remain upright, long after the foundation has turned to sand. In that delay between rot and ruin lies the most deceptive calm of all. The United States entered that calm at the height of its triumph. No invader threatened its borders, no rival could match its power. Yet every system it had built strained beneath the weight of its own success. It was an empire of motion that no longer knew how to stop. The engines of prosperity kept running, even as they burned their own fuel. Industry had moved across oceans to chase cheap labor, leaving behind empty towns and promises. The nation that had once armed the world now imported its own necessities. Credit replaced production. Speculation replaced invention. Numbers climbed on screens, detached from the reality they claimed to measure. Wealth accumulated at the top like air in a sealed room, invisible but suffocating. When the crash came, as all bubbles do, The empire steadied itself by printing more of what it lacked. Trust, now measured in currency. War became routine, a background hum in the machinery of governance. Conflicts flared and faded with the rhythm of election cycles, fought not for victory, but for continuity. Bases circled the globe like beads on a rosary. Drones replaced legions. The Republic had promised to bring democracy abroad, but found itself exporting chaos instead. Each new campaign was justified as the last, a defense of freedom, a stand against tyranny, and each left the borders of order a little thinner. The enemy changed names, changed flags, changed continents, but never truly changed. Empires cannot survive without threats. They invent them when history runs out. At home, the architecture of abundance began to fracture. The middle class, that miracle of the industrial age, dissolved into statistics. Cities gleamed with towers of glass, while the edges of the map turned grey. Infrastructure aged faster than it could be repaired. Faith in institutions aged faster still. The nation that had once been defined by optimism began to speak in irony. Its art obsessed with apocalypse, its politics with nostalgia. Memory replaced vision. The people looked backward for greatness, because the future no longer seemed to belong to them. Technology promised salvation, but delivered exhaustion. The screens that connected the empire also scattered it, turning community into audience, conversation into noise. Data became the new territory to be conquered, privacy the new frontier to be surrendered. In its quest to know everything, the empire forgot what it meant to understand. Surveillance replaced faith as the invisible guardian of order. The world watched itself in real time and mistook observation for control. Meanwhile, the rest of the planet learned the tools the empire had invented. Nations once dependent now competed, their factories humming where American ones had gone silent. The flow of capital reversed course. Influence became negotiation instead of command. The dollar still ruled, but less by loyalty than by habit. Every decade chipped away a fraction of that trust. Every crisis pushed another rival forward. The empire had globalized both wealth and weakness, and now both returned home. Climate, debt, division, each became a frontier the empire could not cross. Nature, indifferent to politics, began to balance its own books. Storms grew stronger, harvests thinner, and the engines of progress consumed what remained. The same innovation that had conquered the atom and the genome could not conquer restraint. The empire had mastered everything except limits. Through it all, the pattern held steady. Expansion, overreach, decadence, denial. Rome had built baths and circuses. America built malls and media. Spain had drowned in silver. America in credit. Britain had ruled the seas. America ruled the invisible tides of finance. Each mistook motion for meaning. Each believed that because the world depended on them, the world would defend them. But dependence is not devotion. The provinces of this modern empire were not territories, but systems, trade routes, currencies, networks. And when those systems began to seek independence, there were no armies to recall them, only statistics that no longer obeyed. Empires die differently now. There are no sackings of capitals, no flames lighting the night. They die by diffusion, their influence seeping outward until the center holds nothing but symbols. The anthem remains, the flag still flies, but the authority behind them becomes ceremonial. Decisions once made in palaces are now made in markets, in boardrooms, in algorithms that no one fully understands. The emperor is replaced by the executive, the priest by the pundit, the citizen by the consumer. Collapse in the modern age is not an event. It is a lifestyle. And yet, decline is never only decay. It is also transformation. From the dust of fallen powers, new orders always rise, carrying fragments of the old. The digital empire born from American invention will outlast America itself. A network of commerce and communication that obeys no capital and needs no crown. The next dominion may not speak of nations at all, but of data, energy, and information. History, having conquered the earth, now turns inward to conquer the human mind. The struggle that once filled continents now fits in the palm of a hand. Perhaps that is the empire's final legacy. The realization that control is an illusion scaled to technology. Rome ruled through stone and road, Britain through sail and steam, America through circuitry. Each believed it had surpassed the last. Each built systems too vast to maintain. The greater the connectivity, the swifter the contagion. When the next collapse comes, it will not be confined to borders, but to bandwidth. The downfall of one will be the downfall of all. Still, the rhythm that undoes civilizations also renews them. After the deluge of the Bronze Age came iron. After Rome's fall, the spark of faith. After the medieval storms, the light of reason. Each ruin planted seeds in its rubble. So it will be again. The empire's decadence will leave behind technology capable of wonders its builders never imagined. Medicines, machines, and memories. Its arrogance will teach the next age humility if the next age can listen. The pattern never ends, but those who survive each turning learn a little more of its language. In the quiet after empire, history remembers differently. The monuments lose their shine. The dates blur. What remains are the lessons, often ignored, always rediscovered. Power demands obedience until it forgets why it wanted it. Wealth creates comfort until comfort kills curiosity. Faith becomes system. System becomes dogma, and dogma breaks under its own certainty. The story of civilization is not one of progress, but of recurrence. The same melody played on finer instruments. Now, as another century turns, the empire still stands, though its heart beats irregularly. Its influence stretches farther than its understanding, its optimism thinner than its nostalgia. The world it once guided now moves without permission. Yet in the glow of its screens and the hum of its cities, it remains magnificent, a dying star whose light will travel for ages after it has gone dark. The final act of empire is not collapse, but illumination. It burns so brightly that its passing becomes the dawn of something new. And so, the wheel completes its circle. Sumer's ledgers, Egypt's monuments, Rome's roads, Britain's ships, America's satellites, all parts of a single pattern written across time. Every empire begins by mastering chaos and ends by preserving it. The same forces that build order inevitably undo it. Ambition, excess, certainty. The pattern is not punishment. It is instruction. It teaches that no power, however vast, is larger than the cycle that sustains it. When the last coin of empire is spent, when the last promise of permanence fades, what remains is the human will to begin again, to gather, to build, to believe. The rivers of Sumer are dust, the pyramids of Egypt sanded by the wind, the marble of Rome ground into lime. And yet cities still rise on the same soil. Civilization survives not because it escapes destruction, but because it accepts it. The pattern never lies. It only waits.